The Cloud of Unknowing, Introduction into the Cloud. There are few books in the history of spirituality that invite us so disarmingly into mystery as The Cloud of Unknowing, written by an anonymous English monk in the 14th century. It opens not with a dogma, but with a paradox. Between the soul and God, says the author, there lies a cloud of unknowing. We cannot pierce it with reason or imagination. The only path through it is love. For he may well be loved, but not thought. By love may he be grasped and held, by thought never. These lines are the portal to the entire work. They overturn centuries of intellectual theology and invite the reader to something far riskier, to leave behind every concept of God, even pious ones, and to enter into a silence that both terrifies and transforms. The anonymous author does not dismiss thought. He was likely a learned man, trained in Latin theology, but he saw that intellect alone could not reach what the heart most longs for. His insight is as bracing now as it was 600 years ago. We do not think our way to God, we surrender our way to God. In an age where knowledge reigns as the highest good, measured, quantified, and monetized, the cloud of unknowing feels shockingly contemporary. It calls into question our addiction to clarity. The monk's message is that true understanding begins when the mind yields to love, when we accept that ultimate truth cannot be contained in words. This is not anti-intellectualism, but trans-intellectualism, the recognition that love, not logic, is the language of the infinite. What this essay proposes is that the Cloud of Unknowing is not merely a devotional manual from medieval England. It is a revolutionary map of consciousness. It reveals how spiritual knowledge arises not from accumulation, but from purification, not from having more ideas, but from releasing them. It shows that the deepest truths are hidden not above thought, but beneath it, in a luminous darkness that the mystics call unknowing. And in that darkness, the soul discovers what it has always been seeking, a God who can be loved but never known. 2. The world behind the cloud, historical context and authorship. The 14th century was an age of both catastrophe and creativity. Europe was reeling from the Black Death, which had killed nearly half the population. The papacy was fractured. The old certainties of Christendom were crumbling. Yet, amid the ruins of institutional authority, a new interior depth emerged. Mysticism flourished not in opposition to orthodoxy, but as its hidden heart. Figures like Meister Eckhart in Germany, Julian of Norwich and Walter Hilton in England, and Catherine of Siena in Italy, were reimagining the life of faith as an inward union rather than external conformity. It was within this atmosphere that the Cloud of Unknowing was written, most likely between 1370 and 1390, in the north of England. The author's identity remains unknown, but linguistic and stylistic clues suggest that he was a member of a contemplative order, perhaps a Carthusian or Benedictine. His English is not the ornamental Middle English of Chaucer, but a plain, homely dialect, the language of a teacher speaking quietly to his student. The book was written, he tells us, for a young soul newly turned from the world, yet it reads less like instruction and more like transmission, a wisdom passed from one who has entered the silence to one who seeks it. The cloud did not arise in isolation. It belongs to a family of writings, all attributed to the same author or his circle. The Book of Privy Counselling, the Epistle of Prayer, and the Epistle of Discretion, in stirrings of the soul. Together they form a small corpus of mystical pedagogy, a kind of medieval spiritual direction. The author draws on earlier sources such as Pseudo-Dionysius's mystical theology, Gregory of Nyssa, and Augustine, but his voice is distinctively English and effective. Where the scholastics reasoned upward through the ladder of being, he descends inward through the ladder of forgetting. This is what I mean when I say, lift up your heart unto God with a meek stirring of love, and mean himself, and none of his works. Forget all things that he has made, and the works of them all, so that your thought or desire be not directed or stretched to any of them, neither in general nor in particular. This is not contempt for creation, but a method of concentration. The contemplative does not despise the world. He releases it so that he might love its source without distraction. The author's project is not to reject knowledge, but to situate it within the greater horizon of love. He is a reformer of interiority. The world of the cloud was one in which faith had become entangled with intellectual display. The universities of Paris and Oxford were alive with theological disputes, yet many devout souls felt spiritually starved. The anonymous monk sought to restore immediacy, to bring the soul into direct communion with God, not through doctrine but through silence. In doing so, he democratized mysticism. One did not need clerical status or erudition to approach God. One needed only a humble heart and the courage to enter the darkness. Third, the cloud as a theology of darkness. 1. The apophatic inheritance. At the heart of the cloud of unknowing lies a radical claim that God cannot be known through the faculties that make us human, reason, imagination, or sense, but only through a loving unknowing that transcends them all. The author stands squarely within the apophatic, or negative, stream of theology that runs from the early Christian mystics of the East to the Rhineland visionaries of the West. He draws especially from Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, who wrote in the mystical theology that one must leave behind all that is perceived and understood, and all that is not, to be united with him who is beyond all being and knowledge. Yet whereas Dionysius wrote in the abstract idiom of Neoplatonism, the English author translates the idea into practical devotion. The unknowing he speaks of is not metaphysical speculation, but lived experience. It is a condition of prayer in which every image, thought, and desire is dissolved in a single movement of love. For of all other creatures and their works, yea, and of the works of God himself, may a man think and have full knowing, but of God himself can no man think, and therefore I will leave all that thing that I can think, and choose to my love that thing which I cannot think. Here, theology becomes an act of surrender. The intellect, he insists, is powerless before the mystery of divine being. It must yield to the heart's simpler faculty, love. The more we attempt to define God, the more we distance ourselves from him, for every concept is a veil. The monk's remedy is not argument, but abandonment, the decision to dwell in the cloud that hides and reveals simultaneously. To modern readers, this may sound paradoxical or even nihilistic, but in the contemplative logic of the cloud, unknowing is not ignorance. It is a higher kind of knowing, an intimacy freed from mediation. The darkness is not the absence of God, but the excess of his presence. Just as bright light blinds the eye, so divine radiance blinds the intellect. Dennis Turner, in The Darkness of God, notes that apophatic mysticism is not the abandonment of reason, but its most rigorous discipline. The anonymous author agrees. He does not reject thought, he places it in proper order. Thought is the ladder by which one climbs, but at the summit one must step off into the cloud. 2. The cloud and the cloud of forgetting. The monk distinguishes between two clouds, the cloud of unknowing that lies between the soul and God, and the cloud of forgetting that lies between the soul and all created things. Only by passing through the latter can one approach the former. Between you and your God there is a cloud of unknowing, and between you and your fellow creatures a cloud of forgetting. If you would go to God, leave the cloud of forgetting beneath you and climb into the cloud of unknowing above you. The cloud of forgetting is the act of detachment, the willingness to relinquish not only worldly concerns, but even spiritual attachments, visions, feelings, consolations. The contemplative must be willing to forget everything that is not God so that the heart may be single. In psychological terms, this is a purification of consciousness. In theological terms, it is kenosis, self-emptying. The cloud of unknowing, by contrast, is not something to be dispelled but entered. It is the threshold where thought ends and love begins. The author's image draws from Exodus 20:21. Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. To step into the darkness is to move from mediated religion to immediate encounter. This dual cloud teaching provides the structure of the whole spiritual path. First, to forget the world. Second, to accept the darkness. And third, to love within it. The contemplative does not emerge from the cloud with new information, but with transformation. As Thomas Merton would later write, the pure heart is the cloud of unknowing itself. 3. The cloud as pedagogy of humility. The most striking feature of the cloud is its refusal to flatter the seeker. The author begins by warning his reader that the work of contemplation is not for the proud or the curious. It demands humility, obedience, and a willingness to fail. This work asketh of thee no long time ere it be truly done, for it is the shortest work that man may imagine. It is neither longer nor shorter than one atom, the least part of time, but in that little moment may heaven be won and lost. Humility in his account is not self-deprecation, but truthfulness. To know oneself as nothing before God is to be liberated from illusion. The cloud thus reverses the scholastic hierarchy. Knowledge no longer elevates, but humbles. The wise man is the one who knows he does not know. Modern psychology might call this the dissolution of ego boundaries. The contemplative empties the false self, the self built on possession, success, or intellect, so that the true self, grounded in God, may emerge. In this sense, the cloud anticipates later insights of depth psychology and phenomenology. The unknowing, it recommends, is not anti-rational but transpersonal. It dissolves the subject-object split that underlies all ordinary cognition. 4. The psychology of contemplation, the practice of unknowing. 1. The movement from multiplicity to simplicity. In the ordinary state, consciousness is dispersed among countless thoughts, desires, and images. The author calls this the common life of Christians, good and moral, yet fragmented. Contemplation begins when the soul gathers itself into unity. Gather yourself wholly, both body and soul, to one word, that is God or love. And when you feel by grace that you are drawn thereto, press upon that cloud with a longing love, and desire God for himself, and none of his goods. This gathering is not concentration in the modern sense, but recollection, the return of the self to its center. The single word acts as an anchor for the heart, preventing it from scattering among distractions. It is the medieval forerunner of what later contemplatives would call the sacred word. The word itself has no magic. It is a sign of consent. The work of prayer is to remain within that consent, letting every thought rise and fall without clinging. The monk instructs his disciple to choose a little word of one syllable: God, love, or peace. The simplicity of the word mirrors the simplicity of the heart. When the mind wanders, the practitioner returns gently to the word, not by effort but by affection. The movement is circular: distraction, return, surrender. Over time, the returning becomes instantaneous. The word dissolves into silence. 2. The discipline of forgetting. The cloud insists that forgetting is an active discipline. To forget does not mean to suppress, but to release. Forget all creatures that ever God made, their works and their conditions, he writes, so that your thought or desire be not directed to any of them. This is the contemplative's fasting, an abstinence of thought. It is tempting, he warns, to fill the silence with holy images or pious ideas. But these too must go. Even thoughts of Christ's humanity or of the saints, however noble, can become obstacles if they stir the imagination more than love. This teaching has scandalized some readers, yet the author's purpose is clear: to move beyond mediation to immediacy. When all forms fall away, God alone remains. Modern practitioners of meditation will recognize this dynamic. The cloud's method parallels Buddhist mindfulness or Vedantic neti-neti, not this, not that. Yet its motivation is distinctively Christian. The goal is not emptiness for its own sake, but the fullness of divine love. The forgetting prepares the heart to receive grace. It does not manufacture it. For he will not be won by thinking, but by loving. And therefore let the root and the ground of your love be naught else but in God himself. 3. Grace and human effort. Throughout the text, the author insists that contemplation is not human achievement, but divine gift. The soul can prepare, but cannot produce union. All striving must give way to consent. For of thyself thou mayest do nothing but only suffer, and that is to abide meekly, moved and drawn by grace. This is the paradox of the cloud's spirituality. It demands both discipline and surrender. One must practice with persistence, yet the fruit of practice comes only when one stops trying to achieve. In modern terms, it is the difference between control and openness. The monk's pedagogy is gentle, yet uncompromising. Let go, even of the desire to succeed at letting go. Grace for him is not a reward, but an atmosphere. the divine presence always already surrounding the soul. When the noise of thought subsides, grace becomes audible. Contemplation, then, is less ascent than awakening. The cloud does not move, the soul simply ceases to flee from it. 4. The fruit of the work. What results from this labor of love and forgetting? Not visions, not ecstasies, but transformation of being. The contemplative becomes, in the author's language, naughted, emptied of self and filled with God's love. The outward signs are humility, patience, and compassion. He that truly seeth and feeleth himself as he is, shall verily be meek, and none may be meek but he that hath truly seen himself. The work of unknowing thus culminates not in mystical elitism, but in ethical simplicity. To love God purely is to love all creatures rightly. The cloud's mystic, unlike the world's ascetic, does not despise the ordinary. He sees it illuminated from within. Having passed through the darkness, he can now perceive creation as sacrament rather than obstacle. V. Love as knowledge, the epistemology of the heart. 1. Love and the limits of thought. The anonymous author's most daring claim is that love is truer than knowledge. Intellect seeks mastery. Love seeks participation. Knowledge implies distance, a knower and the known, but love collapses that distance, making union possible. Hence the monk writes, "He may well be loved, but not thought. By love may he be grasped and held, by thought never." The statement overturns the hierarchy of medieval scholasticism, which treated intellect as humanity's noblest power. The cloud reverses the ladder. At the summit of reason stands the recognition of its own inadequacy. Reason prepares the soul by clarifying truth and purifying motives, yet once it reaches the mystery of God, it must bow to love. This surrender is not irrational, but meta-rational, a higher order of knowing grounded in intimacy rather than inference. To grasp this, one must understand that unknowing is not blankness, but a luminous humility. It is a posture in which the intellect ceases to project its categories and instead receives reality as gift. Love becomes the only epistemic act possible when all concepts fail. As Dennis Turner observes, the cloud shows that the negative way is not against reason, but what happens when reason is taken to its furthest honesty. The author's teaching thus anticipates a truth later echoed by Kierkegaard, who called faith a passion, the highest of all. Wherever the mind ends, love begins, and in that beginning the soul awakens to a form of knowledge no argument can grant. 2. The lover and the beloved. In the cloud's theology, God is not an object to be analyzed, but the beloved who calls. The language is relational, even bridal. The contemplative becomes a lover pursuing the one who hides in the darkness of unknowing. This is not sentimental devotion, but a metaphysics of desire. Love is both the path and the union. By love he may be gotten and held, by thought never. Therefore be not astonished, though I bid thee leave aside every witting, and keep thee in this darkness as long as thou mayest. The dynamic recalls the Song of Songs, long read as an allegory of the soul's marriage with God. In the cloud, the lover is purified of possessiveness. Desire itself becomes self-transcending. To love God purely is to love without why, to will only what God wills. The cloud thus becomes a crucible, where eros is refined into agape. This process is painful. The intellect resists its own dethronement. The heart resists surrender of control. Hence the work's insistence on perseverance. The contemplative must beat upon the cloud with unceasing love until the last traces of self-interest dissolve. Only then can love know as God knows, not through separation, but through participation. 3. The transfiguration of knowledge. What emerges on the far side of unknowing is not ignorance, but illumination. The intellect is not destroyed, but transfigured, now functioning as servant of love. The monk hints at this paradox when he writes that the contemplative shall feel in his soul a marvelous mirth and joy, not known by the senses, but by the ghostly understanding. This ghostly understanding, that is spiritual perception, arises precisely when ordinary cognition ceases. We might say that contemplation is a passage from conceptual to experiential knowledge, from knowing about to knowing with. The scholastics called this connaturality. One understands the good by becoming good. Likewise, one understands God by loving God. Here, the intellect's role is not to define, but to mirror. It becomes transparent to the divine light. Thus, the cloud proposes a new epistemology, knowledge by identity. The mind knows God to the degree that it shares God's nature, and that sharing is effected through love. This notion foreshadows later mystical writers such as John of the Cross, for whom love is the measure whereby we are measured. In modern terms, the monk's insight anticipates the phenomenological claim that encounter precedes concept. God is not something known after experience, but the very condition of experiencing itself. 4. The ethics of unknowing. Love's knowledge is inseparable from humility and charity. To know God by love is to see oneself truthfully, limited, dependent, forgiven. The contemplative who enters the cloud returns to the world changed, not omniscient but compassionate. As the author insists, for he that truly sees and feels himself as he is shall verily be meek, and none may be meek but he that hath truly seen himself. This ethical fruit distinguishes genuine contemplation from escapism. The purpose of unknowing is not isolation, but transformation. The dark silence teaches the soul to act in light. The absence of images yields a life of mercy. Having lost everything in God, the contemplative loves all things through God. Modern spiritual psychology would call this integration. The contemplative no longer divides sacred from secular, prayer from work, contemplation from compassion. The same stillness that filled the cloud now informs daily life. To know by love is to perceive the divine pattern in all things. To live, as the author might say, in the nowhere bodily, but in that nowhere spiritually, where nothing is but God alone. 6. The transformation of the self from ego to transparency. 1. The self as illusion. The cloud psychology of the soul anticipates later contemplative traditions in which the self is seen as a construct. For the anonymous author, sin is not merely moral failure, but the false orientation of self-centered consciousness. Contemplation dismantles this illusion by confronting the soul with its own nothingness. This work asketh that a man forsake the knowing and feeling of his being, and of all other beings. For he that hath a true desire to be one with God, he must lose the feeling of his self-being. The phrasing is startlingly close to Buddhist anatta, or Meister Eckhart's Gelassenheit, letting be, yet it remains thoroughly Christian. Self-loss is not nihilism, but participation in divine being. The contemplative does not cease to exist. He ceases to exist apart from God. 2. Kenosis and Christic pattern. Behind this anthropology lies the Christic model of kenosis, the self-emptying of the Word in the Incarnation. Just as Christ emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, Philippians 2:7, so the contemplative must empty himself of self-will. The cloud thus presents the interior life as imitation of Christ's descent. Humility is not moral posture, but ontological alignment with divine love, which always gives itself away. To enter the cloud is to follow Christ into Gethsemane, into the hiddenness of obedience and trust. When the intellect falls silent and the ego dissolves, what remains is not vacancy but communion, the mind of Christ in the soul. 3. Psychological integration. From a modern psychological perspective, the cloud describes what Carl Jung might call the transcendent function, the integration of conscious and unconscious through surrender to a higher center. By confronting the unknowing within, the contemplative reconciles the divided psyche. The cloud becomes an image of depth, the dark, fertile ground from which transformation arises. The monk, of course, knew nothing of depth psychology, yet his method embodies its wisdom. He instructs the disciple not to fight thoughts, but to let them pass, a technique identical to contemporary mindfulness. But whereas mindfulness seeks equanimity, the cloud seeks union. The practitioner's identity gradually shifts from the isolated ego to the spacious awareness of love itself. This transformation bears ethical consequences. The person who no longer clings to self possesses an unshakable serenity, outwardly ordinary. Inwardly he lives from a depth of stillness that radiates peace. As the author says, he that hath learned to be nothing, him nothing may grieve. 4. The dark night as gift. The cloud anticipates later mystics' descriptions of the dark night. The darkness is not punishment but pedagogy. It strips away the senses so the soul may be taught by absence. At first the seeker feels desolation, the loss of divine sweetness. But this deprivation is itself the work of love, for only through emptiness can the heart be filled anew. When thou thinkest to find God, thou findest him not. But when thou thinkest thou canst not find him, then thou findest him most fully. Such reversals mark the text's genius. The very failure of prayer becomes its success. When the contemplative can no longer feel God, love alone endures, and that endurance is union. Thus the cloud transforms despair into doorway, unknowing into revelation. 7. The cloud in conversation with tradition. 1. English contemplatives and their kin. The anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing did not write in isolation. He stands within a constellation of English mystics who, together, reshaped the inner landscape of late medieval Christianity. Walter Hilton's Scale of Perfection offered a stepwise ascent toward charity. The hermit Richard Rolle sang of the fire of love that inflamed the heart. Julian of Norwich proclaimed that all shall be well. Yet none spoke in quite the same voice as the Cloud author. His tone is stripped, spare, and unadorned, a manual of interior practice rather than visionary theology. Press ever more into the cloud of unknowing with a loving stirring that shall never cease. Hilton emphasized ordered virtue, Rowley sought sweetness, Julian offered consolation, the cloud offers discipline, a way to strip even spiritual pleasure of possessiveness. Its austerity complements Julian's tenderness, forming two poles of the English mystical temperament, ardent love and silent surrender. Together, they model a spirituality both affective and apophatic, emotional yet interiorly still. 2. Continental parallels. Eckhart, Tauler, and Ruysbroek. Across the Channel, the Rhineland mystics were speaking a remarkably similar dialect of divine darkness. Meister Eckhart preached of the grunt, the ground of the soul, where God is born. Johannes Tauler described the leaving of all images. Jan van Ruysbroek envisioned the soul melting into the wild wilderness of God. Though no evidence proves direct contact, the parallels suggest a shared current of interior Christianity circulating through Europe's monastic and lay circles. Like Eckhart, the Cloud author insists that union with God requires detachment even from the idea of God. Yet, where Eckhart employs bold metaphysics, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. The English writer speaks in the humble idiom of a spiritual father to his pupil. His genius lies not in speculative daring, but in psychological exactitude. He knows how thought seduces, how piety inflates the ego, how the soul mistakes emotion for encounter. His language of clouds and forgetting translates continental abstraction into practical counsel. 3. The sacramental world and the interior turn. The Cloud was composed in an era when religion was still vividly sacramental: bells, incense, relics, processions. To speak of God in darkness was, therefore, countercultural. Yet the author never denies the sacraments. He interiorizes them. The true altar, he implies, is the purified heart. The true offering is attention itself. Lift up thine heart unto God with a meek stirring of love, and mean himself and none of his goods. This inward sacrament does not abolish the outer rites, but fulfills them. The Eucharist feeds contemplation, contemplation realizes the Eucharist. Thus, the Cloud of Unknowing stands at the hinge between medieval piety and modern interiority. It preserves devotion's warmth while redirecting its focus from form to essence, from symbol to presence. 4. A bridge across time. In later centuries, the cloud became a hidden wellspring for renewal. 17th-century English recusants and early Quakers absorbed its silence. Evelyn Underhill revived it in the 20th century. Thomas Merton read it in the Kentucky woods and found in its pages the contemplative antidote to modern noise. Merton wrote that the true contemplative is not one who sits apart from the world, but who, having entered the cloud, finds God everywhere. The cloud's lineage thus extends from medieval cloisters to modern hermitages, from monastic cells to meditation halls. Wherever silence becomes prayer, its spirit endures. 8. The cloud and the wider mystical confluence. 1. Parallels beyond Christianity. Though deeply rooted in Christian revelation, the Cloud of Unknowing speaks a language recognizable across the world's contemplative traditions. In Buddhism, the via negativa appears as shunyata, emptiness that is not void but openness. Zen masters speak of mu, the wordless no-thing that liberates mind from grasping. The cloud's counsel, forget all things that he has made, mirrors the Zen injunction to drop all attachments, even to enlightenment itself. In Sufism, Jalal al-Din Ruma proclaims, love is the astrolabe of God's mysteries. The Sufi Fana, annihilation in divine love, echoes the cloud's call to lose self-feeling in God. Hindu Bhakti too knows this surrender. The devotee who repeats the divine name until only the beloved remains performs, in another idiom, the same beating upon the cloud. These convergences do not imply sameness. The Christian contemplative seeks union with a personal God revealed in Christ. Yet they reveal a shared anthropology, the recognition that ultimate reality eludes the grasping mind and can be approached only through self-emptying love. The cloud therefore functions as a bridge, not syncretic but sympathetic, between traditions that meet in silence. 2. The psychology of darkness in modern terms. Modern psychology, too, has rediscovered the wisdom implicit in the cloud's darkness. The 20th century's contemplative renewal, through Thomas Keating's centering prayer, John Mayne's Christian meditation, and the mindfulness movement, translates the cloud's method into contemporary idiom. Its insistence on a little word that returns the mind to stillness anticipates today's understanding of attentional anchoring. The counsel to watch thoughts pass like motes in the air aligns with cognitive theories of non-attachment. Yet, psychology alone cannot capture the depth of what the cloud means by love. For the monk, love is not emotion, but ontological participation, the soul's share in God's being. The contemplative silence is therefore not relaxation, but transformation, a shift from self-reference to divine reference. In the cloud, consciousness itself becomes prayer. 3. The cloud as counter-modern manifesto. If the 14th century suffered from the noise of disputation, our own age drowns in the roar of information. Data have replaced wisdom. Attention has become the rarest virtue. Into this crisis, the Cloud of Unknowing speaks with prophetic clarity. Its very first lesson, that truth cannot be grasped by accumulation, reverses the logic of the digital age. In the world of metrics and screens, the cloud teaches the holiness of unproductivity, to sit, to breathe, to love without object. This work asketh that thou do but one thing, that thou set thy intent wholly unto God, with a loving desire, and let all else be. Its counsel could serve as the manifesto of a contemplative humanism for the 21st century. The monk's one little word becomes a protest against the empire of noise, a reminder that being is deeper than doing, and that silence is not emptiness but presence in its purest form. 4. The ethics of the cloud today. In a world fractured by ideology, the cloud offers a pedagogy of humility. To dwell in unknowing is to relinquish the arrogance of certainty. The contemplative who abides in silence cannot easily demonize others, for he knows the mystery that transcends every name. This humility becomes social virtue. Patience, empathy, non-violence. The practice of unknowing thus bears public fruit. It grounds what might be called a politics of reverence. Imagine, the monk might say, a civilization that prayed before it spoke, that paused before it judged, that loved before it theorized. Such a world would not be less intelligent, but more wise. To recover the cloud of unknowing is therefore to recover a forgotten dimension of humanity, the capacity to live from silence rather than from noise, from love rather than from control. 9. The enduring vision, unknowing as revelation. 1. The paradox of the cloud. The final paradox of the cloud of unknowing is that its darkness is radiant. What seems concealment becomes manifestation. What begins as ignorance ends in wisdom. The anonymous author writes, "When thou thinkest to find God, thou findest him not. But when thou thinkest thou canst not find him, then thou findest him most fully." Here the contemplative discovers that the very act of surrender, the relinquishing of images and ideas, is itself revelation. The unknowing is not a void in which God is absent, but the space in which God finally appears without disguise. As a candle can only be seen in darkness, so divine presence becomes visible only when the mind's brightness is dimmed. This paradox defines the mystical way. The failure of the intellect is the success of love. In that failure, the soul learns the one knowledge worth having, that God is not an object to be grasped, but a presence to be received. Hence the author's insistence that contemplation is not a matter of seeing something new, but of becoming someone new. The cloud is the womb of transformation. 2. The revelation of hiddenness. The cloud, therefore, redefines revelation itself. It is not the disclosure of propositions, but the awakening of participation. To know God in this sense is to share God's own mode of being, creative, loving, self-emptying. The moment the contemplative ceases to demand clarity, revelation occurs in a subtler register, as stillness, as peace, as sheer existence. Modern theology, especially after the collapse of old certainties, finds in this mysticism a remedy for idolatry. In an age weary of literalism, the cloud teaches a faith that is at once devout and self-critical, a faith mature enough to live with mystery. As Dennis Turner notes, apophatic theology is the disciplined refusal to make God in our own image. That refusal is the heart of worship. God may well be loved, but he cannot be thought. The sentence reads like a commandment against the modern temptation to reduce mystery to system. It is also a liberation, for once the intellect yields, the heart becomes capable of infinite expansion. 3. Love as ontology. The author's ultimate insight is not psychological, but ontological. Love is not merely how we approach God, it is what God is. When the contemplative loves, it is God loving through him. In this realization, the boundary between human and divine blurs without erasing difference. Love becomes the shared medium of existence, the atmosphere of all that is real. In this way, the cloud of unknowing performs what it describes, a turning of the soul from analysis to communion. The intellect's surrender is not humiliation but consummation. It discovers its own deepest truth in loving. To borrow from later mystics, the eye with which I love God is the same eye with which God loves me. Thus the treatise ends where it began, in a love that cannot be thought, yet thinks all things anew. X. Conclusion. Why the cloud still matters. 1. A wisdom for our century. Why does this 14th-century text speak so powerfully to the 21st? Because the human dilemma it addresses has not changed. We live, as the monk did, amid a surfeit of words and a famine of silence. Our technologies have multiplied communication but thinned communion. We mistake information for understanding and distraction for freedom. Against this backdrop, the cloud of unknowing reads as both diagnosis and cure. It reminds us that truth begins where noise ends. To enter the cloud today is to reclaim attention, to rediscover that the most radical act in an age of visibility is to be still and unseen. Its discipline of one little word becomes a contemplative ecology for the modern soul, a refusal to fragment, a return to wholeness. Its humility counters ideology, its silence heals exhaustion. In a culture that measures value by clarity and output, the cloud offers a counter-economy of presence. Be still and you shall know. 2. Spiritual psychology of the future. The contemporary rediscovery of contemplative practice, through mindfulness, centering prayer, and interfaith dialogue, shows that the cloud's wisdom anticipated modern psychology by centuries. Its cloud of forgetting corresponds to the therapeutic letting go of cognitive rumination. Its cloud of unknowing parallels the receptive consciousness that transcends ego boundaries. Yet its horizon remains theological. Love, not awareness, is the goal. In this lies its lasting challenge to secular spirituality. Awareness alone cannot save, only love transforms. The cloud invites a psychology that is not self-referential, but theocentric, a discipline of surrender rather than optimization. It reminds us that the self is healed not by perfect knowledge of itself, but by participation in something infinitely larger. 3. The moral fruit of contemplation. The author never tires of warning that contemplation without virtue is illusion. The one who emerges from the cloud must return to the world bearing its fragrance, gentleness, mercy, and patience. The acid test of mystical experience is ethical transformation. True unknowing breeds compassion, because to dwell in mystery is to sense the precious fragility of all beings. For he that truly seeth himself shall verily be meek, and none may be meek but he that hath truly seen himself. In this humility lies the moral genius of the cloud, knowledge that makes one kind. Its silent prayer flowers into justice, its hiddenness becomes hospitality. The contemplative who has learned to see God nowhere learns also to see God everywhere, in neighbor, stranger, and foe. 4. The final word. At the book's close, the monk assures his reader that the work of unknowing need not take a lifetime. It may happen in one atom of time, for the eternal now is always present. That atom, the infinitesimal instant of surrender, contains the whole of heaven. This work asketh no long time, ere it be once truly done, for it is the shortest work that man may imagine. In that moment the seeker ceases to seek. The lover and the beloved are one. The cloud remains, yet it no longer obscures. It shines from within as the luminous dark of divine intimacy. The anonymous voice fades, but its echo endures, not as doctrine, but as invitation. Enter the cloud. Let love, not thought, be your knowing. There, in the stillness beyond words, the infinite awaits. Epilogue, the timeless silence. Perhaps the greatest tribute to the Cloud of Unknowing is its author's anonymity. He practiced what he preached, self-erasure in service of love. His very namelessness becomes the final teaching. For when the seeker no longer needs a name, the cloud has done its work. Across 6 centuries his whisper persists, "Be still, my friend, and look up with a meek stirring of love. Forget all that thou canst think, and press into that darkness. There shalt thou find no thing, and in that no thing all."